Darkness covered the land from the 6th hour to the 9th, not metaphorical darkness. The sky itself went black over Jerusalem, while a man hung nailed to a Roman cross, and the crowd that had gathered to watch fell silent in a way that crowds almost never do. Then, from the cross, a voice broke through that silence with a cry so raw, so utterly human, that it has unsettled theologians, mystics, and scholars for 2,000 years. 4 words, spoken in Aramaic, the language Jesus used every day of his life, words so charged with meaning that the gospel writers refused to translate them and preserve the original sound instead. Most people have heard these 4 words their entire lives and been told they express abandonment. But the Aramaic tradition that produced them, the contemplative lineage that preserved their inner meaning long before the Church institutionalized its interpretation, says something entirely different. These 4 words are not a cry of defeat. They are the most precise map of the awakening threshold ever spoken aloud, and they were spoken at the exact moment the entire physical and energetic weight of human experience converged in a single point, the moment before the cry. To hear what these 4 words actually carry, you first have to stand inside the moment from which they emerged, not as a historical observer, but as someone willing to feel the full weight of what was happening. Jesus had been on the cross for approximately 6 hours. The physical reality of crucifixion was total. The weight of the body pulling against the nails, the difficulty of breathing, the slow collapse of every system that sustains life. Roman crucifixion was designed not merely to kill, but to strip away every layer of dignity, identity, and social standing from the person being executed. It was death engineered as erasure, and yet the gospel accounts record that throughout this process, Jesus spoke. He addressed the soldiers who crucified him. He spoke to the 2 criminals executed alongside him. He made arrangements for his mother's care. He recited a psalm. Every word he spoke before the 4th hour carried the quality of someone who remained, in some essential interior way, oriented present to what was happening without being dissolved by it. Then the darkness came, and something changed. Not in the external circumstances alone. The crucifixion was already complete in its brutality, but in something interior, something that the contemplative tradition identifies as the final threshold, the point at which the individual consciousness encounters the absolute boundary of what it can hold while remaining tethered to its familiar sense of self. This is the threshold that mystics across traditions have described under different names: the dark night of the soul, the void, the dissolution of the constructed self. It is the point at which every framework the mind has used to make meaning of experience stops working, not because the meaning was false, but because something larger than meaning is attempting to move through. In the 9th hour, from within that darkness, Jesus cried out. And the 4 words he chose were not chosen randomly. They were the opening of a psalm that every person in that crowd would have known. A text that begins in anguish and ends in something else entirely. The choice of those 4 words was itself a teaching, delivered from the outer limit of human endurance. What the 4 words actually say, the 4 words preserved in the original Aramaic, are these: Eli, Eli, Lama Sabachthani. Every major translation renders this as, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that translation is not wrong. It is accurate as far as it reaches. But the Aramaic carries dimensions that the English cannot hold, and those dimensions are precisely where the teaching lives. The first word, Eli, is not the formal theological term for God used in official religious settings. It is the intimate address, the word a child uses with a parent when there is no distance between them and no need for ceremony. In the Aramaic tradition, Eli carries within it the presumption of closeness. You do not call to someone far away with this word. You call to someone you have always known was present. The third word, Lama, is translated as why, but in Aramaic, Lama carries more than a request for logical explanation. It is a word that opens toward mystery rather than argument. When Lama is spoken from a place of genuine anguish, it is not demanding an answer that fits inside existing understanding. It is cracking open the very structure of understanding itself, creating a space large enough for something beyond explanation to enter. The fourth word, Sabachthani comes from the Aramaic root shavaq, and here is where the institutional translation has done the most damage. Shavaq does not mean only to forsake or abandon. In Aramaic usage, shavaq also carries the meaning to release, to set free, to allow, to pass through. The same root appears in Aramaic texts, where it describes the releasing of a breath, the loosening of a knot, the opening of a hand that had been clenched. Read through this lens, the 4 words do not describe abandonment. They describe release. My God, to what end have you set me free? The cry from the cross becomes not the final word of a man losing his connection to the divine, but the threshold question of a consciousness being released from every structure that had previously contained it. After this video was first shared, hundreds asked the same question. Where can they go deeper? We put together a complete guide with everything you need. The link is in the comments. What makes this moment even more precise is that Jesus did not compose these 4 words in his final hour. Quote, Tem. Every person standing at the foot of that cross, the Roman soldiers, the Jewish elders, the disciples who had remained, would have recognized the opening line of Psalm 22 the moment they heard it. This was not incidental. In the Jewish tradition of the time, quoting the opening verse of a psalm was a way of invoking the entire psalm, the way citing the first line of a well-known song causes the complete arc of that song to rise in the listener's awareness. Jesus was not only speaking his own experience, he was pointing, from within that experience, to a specific text that the crowd already carried inside them. And Psalm 22 is extraordinary in its movement. It begins in the most acute possible anguish, a voice calling out into apparent silence, feeling entirely surrounded and abandoned, the body described in terms that the early church would recognize as precise prophetic language about the crucifixion itself. But the psalm does not end there. It pivots. At its center, something shifts. The speaker does not receive an answer to the anguish, but the orientation of the speaker changes. By the final third of the psalm, the voice that began in desolation is declaring that God has not hidden from the affliction of the afflicted, has not turned away. The structure of the psalm itself enacts the threshold. The descent into the void is the same movement that, if followed all the way through, opens into a completely different quality of awareness on the other side. In the Gnostic tradition, this is understood as the map of initiation, the outer dissolution, the death of every structure that the ego has built around itself is not the end of consciousness. It is the condition that makes a different quality of consciousness possible. What dies on the cross, in this reading, is not Jesus. What dies is the possibility of experiencing the divine as something external, something that can be present or absent, something that can abandon or remain. What emerges from that death is the recognition that the presence was never outside, that Eli, the intimate address, the word that presupposes closeness, was always already answered before it was spoken. If this transmission is landing in you, the complete guide in the pinned comment carries the Aramaic sounds, their full meaning, and the protocols for those ready to go further. There is a reason the 4 words were preserved in Aramaic in the Greek Gospels, while nearly everything else was translated. And there is an equally important reason why, once translated, the institutional interpretation that settled around them was the one that emphasized abandonment rather than release. The abandonment reading serves a specific theological architecture. It positions the moment on the cross as the point at which the Son of God took on the full weight of human sinfulness and was separated from the Father by it. This is a coherent reading within the framework of substitutionary atonement, the idea that Jesus died as a substitute, absorbing punishment that was owed to humanity. Within that framework, the cry of abandonment is necessary. It is the evidence that the separation was real. But the Aramaic communities that preserved these teachings before the Greek-speaking church institutionalized its interpretation, had a different understanding of what happened on the cross. For them, the crucifixion was not primarily a legal transaction. It was an initiation, the most complete and public demonstration ever given of the passage through the threshold that every consciousness must eventually cross on its way to gnosis, to direct knowledge of the divine reality within. In this reading, the cry Eli Eli Lama Sabachthani is not the evidence of separation. It is the sound of the final veil dissolving. The question, Lama, to what end? For what purpose? is not a demand that God explain himself. It is the sound of a consciousness releasing its last grip on the framework of understanding that had previously organized its experience of reality. It is the question asked at the exact moment when asking questions in the old way is no longer possible. This interpretation did not disappear. It was preserved in fragments across the Nag Hammadi texts in the Gospel of Philip. In the Coptic traditions that survived outside the reach of the councils that standardized Christian doctrine in the 4th century, these texts consistently present the crucifixion not as an event of divine abandonment, but as the supreme demonstration of what lies on the other side of the ego's final dissolution. The 4 words were kept in Aramaic because their power was acoustic as much as semantic. The sounds themselves, the depth of Eli resonating through the chest, the opening quality of Lama, the release encoded in Sabachthani, were understood to carry a vibrational transmission that translation would sever. The Church translated the meaning. The Aramaic communities preserved the frequency. The complete guide is pinned in the first comment, the most important Aramaic words, their exact pronunciation, and the full activation protocols. For those ready to go deeper, the link is there waiting. 2,000 years of distance can make it easy to treat this moment as an event that happened once, to one person, in a specific location, under specific political and religious conditions that no longer exist. But the Aramaic tradition and the contemplative lineage that runs through the Gnostic texts understood the crucifixion as a transmission, not primarily a historical event, but a map of interior territory that every human consciousness will eventually have to navigate. The threshold that the 4 words describe is not unique to Jesus. Every person who has ever followed the interior path with genuine commitment has encountered the version of it that belongs to their own life. The moment when the frameworks that previously organized meaning stop working. The moment when the certainty that God, or truth, or love, or whatever word the person uses for the ground of their experience, is present and responsive suddenly becomes inaccessible. The silence that follows that moment. Most people, when they hit this threshold, interpret it exactly the way the institutional church interpreted the cry from the cross, as abandonment, as evidence that something has gone wrong, that the path has failed, or that they have failed the path. They retreat. They construct new frameworks to fill the silence. They find teachers or doctrines or practices that restore the feeling of certainty without requiring them to pass all the way through the void. The 4 words of Jesus from the cross say something different to anyone who has ears to hear them through their Aramaic resonance. They say, "This silence is not the absence of the divine. This release of every structure you use to locate the divine within your experience is not loss. The question you are asking from within this darkness, Lama, to what end, is not a question that will be answered from outside. It is a question that, if you remain with it completely, will dissolve the assumption that you and the divine were ever in 2 different places." Eli, the intimate address, not the formal theological name. The word that presupposes closeness, even in the act of calling out. The cry of someone who, even at the outer limit of endurance, is not calling to something distant. They are calling to something they have always, at the deepest level, known was inseparable from themselves. This is the teaching the 4 words carry, not as doctrine to be believed, as territory to be entered, as a threshold that has been mapped by the most precise instrument available, a human life taken all the way to its outer limit, so that every consciousness that reaches the same threshold can recognize where it is and know that what lies on the other side is not abandonment. It is release. In the 9th hour, in darkness that covered an entire city, 4 Aramaic words were spoken from a cross outside Jerusalem. They were spoken at the outer limit of physical and interior endurance, by a man who had spent his life transmitting the precise teaching of how consciousness awakens through direct experience rather than inherited doctrine. The Gospel writers kept those 4 words in the original language because they understood, or preserved the understanding, that their power was inseparable from their sound. Eli, Eli, Lama Sabachthani. The intimate address spoken twice, not because the speaker had lost their sense of connection, but because intimacy was the only orientation that remained when everything else had dissolved. The question opened into mystery rather than demanding explanation, and the final word, Sabachthani, carrying in its Aramaic root not only the wound of apparent abandonment, but the possibility of release, of being set free from every structure that had previously mediated the relationship between the individual and the ground of all experience. The Gnostic tradition preserved what the institutional church translated away, that the cry from the cross is the most complete map ever given of the threshold every consciousness must cross on its way to direct knowledge of the divine reality within. The descent into the void is not the failure of the path. It is the condition that makes gnosis possible, the direct, unmediated recognition that the presence sought has never been outside. These 4 words were spoken once, publicly, at the intersection of the greatest suffering and the greatest transmission in the tradition. But they are not only a historical event, they are a living frequency, spoken in their original Aramaic, allowed to resonate through the body rather than simply be processed by the mind. They carry the vibrational signature of the threshold itself. They are an invitation not to believe something, but to recognize something that has always been present beneath the noise of the search. Eli Eli Lama Sabachthani. Speak them slowly. Let the sounds move through you. And notice what, inside you, begins to release. Everything in this video is the foundation. The complete guide is pinned in the first comment. The most important Aramaic words, their exact pronunciation, and the full activation protocols. For those ready to go deeper, the link is there waiting for you. And if this activated something in you, if you felt a shift while watching, you are ready for what comes next. In the next video, we enter the Aramaic activation codes for healing, the precise frequency sequence Jesus used to restore the body at the cellular level. The same technology, a deeper transmission. Do not miss Italiano. Right now, before you close this video, speak these 4 words aloud. Eli Lama. Then come to the comments and tell us. What did you feel? What shifted? We read every single response. And if this teaching found you today, subscribe to this channel. Every week we go deeper into the ancient frequency codes that were always meant to be yours.